Russia has ordered troops to prepare for nuclear strikes in the latest round of sabre rattling drills that have so far failed to curb Ukraine from its successful campaign of long-range attacks deep inside Russian soil.
Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of the action. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start today with Russia's nuclear sabre rattling, something that we've seen before, but that we've seen pretty intensely over the last few days, and which has come as a direct response of the topic we covered last week, and that was the green light given by allies to Ukraine to use Western weapons in the successful strikes against targets on Russian soil, particularly those strikes against oil refineries. Now, we've seen a significant response from Russia, at least a significant rhetorical response from Russia. On Monday, Russia's Ministry of Defense announced that it was going to launch nuclear drills with non-strategic nuclear weapons involving its missile forces, aircraft and maritime forces to increase the preparedness, was the word they used, to deploy non-strategic nuclear weapons. Now, non-strategic nuclear weapons, those are tactical nuclear weapons, generally weapons that have a shorter range and a shorter yield, so they're less powerful, not designed to blast intercontinentally from continent to continent across oceans, rather more likely to be used in a sort of battlefield scenario, a bit like many of the missiles we've already seen used in Ukraine. The difference is these would have nuclear warheads and could take out areas perhaps the size of a few football pitches, destroy military units, companies, regiments at a time rather than entire cities. But that warning, that specific warning that Russia would be carrying out non-strategic nuclear drills with its southern military command was a direct response to comments from the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary and others suggesting that some of Ukraine's allies had no qualms, had no objections to Kyiv using the weapons that they were supplying, Western weapons, to hit targets deep inside Russia. Now, also in response to those comments, on Monday we saw Moscow summon the British ambassador to Russia, Nigel Casey, to the Russian Foreign Ministry, where he was given a pretty stern dressing down. And the official account of that, Russian state news agencies specifically said that he had been warned that were British weapons to be used in strikes against Russia, then what Russia said, British military bases inside Ukraine could be targeted. Britain would dispute the fact it doesn't have any military bases inside Ukraine, but they also warned that British bases or British targets outside Ukraine could also be targeted. So that was a clear sign of the Kremlin's anger and upset at the direction of travel and at the Western allies' support for Ukraine, and particularly Britain's forward-leaning position on its weapons being able to be used. Now, that has only been built on recently by the most recent comments by President Vladimir Putin, who used his Victory Day speech in Moscow to stress, in a muted way perhaps, but that nonetheless that Russia's strategic forces were combat ready. Now, strategic forces is a veiled reference to Russia's nuclear forces, and those strategic forces are not the tactical weapons, those are the strategic nuclear weapons. Those are the doomsday weapons that can blast between continents and take out cities. Of course, in the background, the mood music from the Kremlin's similarly warlike. We heard from ex-Russian President Dmitry Medvedev saying that nowhere would be safe. Specifically, he said no one could hide in Downing Street, Washington, or the Elysee Palace in Paris, singling out Britain, America, and France for their support for Ukraine. So that has been a ratcheting up of the rhetoric, a chance for us to understand how Russia is feeling about the West's support for Ukraine, but perhaps also worth taking a step back and wondering, does this push us to the brink of World War III? Of course, that is the worst case scenario. That is what both sides are eager and anxious to avoid. of course, it remains a risk. We've heard this sort of nuclear sabre rattling before. It is Russia's go-to position when perhaps Moscow feels threatened. But as many of you pointed out in the comments in your response to last week's update when we talked about these weapons being used in this way, there was a sense of sort of natural injustice. Why is it okay for Russia to use weapons from Iran, from North Korea, from China to attack targets in Ukraine, but somehow it's not okay for Ukraine to use weapons from the United Kingdom and the West writ large to attack targets inside Russia? And that is why certainly a position or a logic shared by those in the United Kingdom and some of Ukraine's other allies who have signalled that their weapons can be used. Now, it's been an interesting week on the sort of political front in terms of the gesture politics that we've seen on both sides. On Monday, as I mentioned, Russia's Ministry of Defence announced those nuclear drills. That was the same day that Britain's ambassador Nigel Casey was summoned to the Foreign Ministry. On Tuesday, we had Vladimir Putin's inauguration for his 5th term as president in the Great Hall of the Kremlin Palace. Now, this was a deliberately theatrical affair where, Vladimir Putin indulged his desire to be seen in the context of a modern-day Russian Tsar. Indeed, Patriarch Kirill, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, even called him Your Highness when he addressed him during that ceremony. It was boycotted by a number of Western representatives. Nonetheless, there were some there, and notably among the guests was the former Hollywood star Steven Seagal, a year senior to Vladimir Putin. Seagal 72 to Putin 71. The two men reportedly becoming friends through their mutual love of martial arts. Vladimir Putin's message on that occasion, he insisted that he wanted Russia to be treated as an equal and did not want a conflict with the West. But nonetheless, actions appear to suggest otherwise, and that veiled threat about his nuclear forces. On Wednesday, we saw Britain expel the defence attaché, the Russian defence attaché here in London, on allegations that he had been an undeclared intelligence operative. Now, Colonel Maxim Evelik had been here for over a decade and was widely known by Britain's spy chiefs to be a serving member of Russia's GRU military intelligence agency, the same GRU that was thought to be behind the deadly nerve agent Novichok attacks in Salisbury in 2018. Remember, they left innocent mum of 3, Dawn Sturgis, dead, although the targets of that attack, the Skripals, survived. It's not clear why this colonel survived so many previous culls of Russian spies in the United Kingdom. In the wake of that attack in 2018, some 23 Russian spies were kicked out of Britain. More were kicked out in the wake of Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And suggestions to me that may be because British authorities, British security services wanted to keep an eye on him. There's also a suggestion that the events which led to him being expelled most recently were part of this broader pattern across Europe of an increased tempo of Russian espionage and sabotage activity. Britain's Home Secretary specifically mentioned when he announced it an arson attack against a Ukrainian-owned logistics company in Leighton, north of London, which the suggestion was Russia's defence attaché may have been involved somehow in enabling or in orchestrating or perhaps even recruiting those who were involved. On Thursday, it was Russia's Victory Day Parade, the annual event, a hugely symbolic event in Russia when it commemorates the Russian victory over the Nazis during World War II, what Russia refers to as the Great Patriotic War. Of course, Russia remembers the Second World War with slightly different dates to those of us in the United Kingdom because they tend to forget the early part of the war when they were in league with the Nazis and only really start counting from the moment that Hitler attacked Russia and then Russia became allies with the United Kingdom, the United States and the other allied powers. That ceremony in Moscow was a slimmed down, slightly subdued affair, certainly compared to some of the more grand ceremonies we've seen in the past, with over 11,000 troops and dozens of main battle tanks. This year, like last year, just one lonely T-34 Russian tank leading the parade. Putin was there with his nuclear briefcase, as always, never far from that briefcase, which in theory would let him launch nuclear weapons in the event of a sort of catastrophic doomsday conflict. As ever, a bit of theatre about these events. The UK's Defence Intelligence Agency reported that some 23 planned Victory Day parades across other parts of Russia were cancelled because of security concerns, and we know that Moscow was under huge heightened security while that parade took place, including extra air defence systems and soldiers seen with anti-drone weapons in case of a possible attack from Ukraine. Ukraine has managed to hit Moscow with its drones in the past, although, as I said at the very beginning, Ukraine's focus now appears to be much more on those strategic oil refineries to try and degrade Russia's ability to maintain both its economy and its armed forces in the fight inside Ukraine. Other news today that we must address is there appears to have been a ground assault by Russian forces on the Kharkiv border. Kharkiv is, as we speak, under attack, and President Volodymyr Zelensky has described fierce fighting there. There's been speculation for many, many weeks, if not months, that Russia has been preparing a possible offensive on this second city of Kharkiv, which is just, the edge of Kharkiv city is just about 15 miles from the Russian border, and it repelled a Russian tank assault on the first day of the war in 2022. Since then, it's faced an almost daily bombardment of missiles and drones. The life in the city has sort of ebbed and flowed as the intensity of those Russian attacks have increased and decreased over the last 2+ years. There's debate at the moment as to whether or not this is the first stage of a real offensive to try and retake either territory on the border or to indeed threaten the city. What we've been seeing over the last week, as we've been seeing over the last few weeks, in fact, is a massive uptick in Russian activity across the front line, but particularly in the east. Suggestions of about 20% increase in the number of attacks, particularly around Avdiivka, which you remember was the trophy town near Donetsk city that Russia captured earlier this year. Fighting in Kupiansk has remained pretty intense. That's further round to the north, but also on the eastern front. Most recently now, these attacks in Kharkiv. Now, it could also be an attempt to distract or destabilise the region, to force Ukraine to stretch its defensive forces more thinly. We've heard today that Ukraine has moved reinforcements up to the border. The mayor of Kharkiv region insisting that so far they have not ceded any territory to these attacks, which they put down initially to Russian saboteurs rather than saboteurs, suggesting that it was not necessarily an armoured infantry assault, but something on a different scale. That's worth keeping an eye on, and we'll see where that goes. One more topic I wanted to pick up on this week, and that's the F-16s. We always get a lot of questions about the F-16s. I was speaking to somebody today suggesting that they believe the first F-16s will arrive in Ukraine within the next few weeks. So most likely end of May or early June. Now, so it's also worth saying that they do not necessarily think these planes are going to turn the tide of the conflict. I mean, crucially, it's not the planes themselves, but it will be the weapons on them that will be most important in terms of what they can achieve. But it will also require, for these planes to be as effective as possible, it will require a whole mindset shift in how they are used by Ukraine's armed forces, because ultimately F-16s, like other fighter jets, are vulnerable to being shot down, and so how the missions that they engage in are planned will require an awful lot of it will be incredibly complex and require an awful lot of input and sort of engagement and cooperation from every level of Ukraine's military to have the maximum effect. The short explanation is they don't just want to fly them within range of sophisticated Russian air defences and see these American F-16s or American-made F-16s, but actually which are coming from Denmark and the Netherlands, shot down immediately. They may well be used at standoff to launch long-range weapons if they can carry them, like Britain's Storm Shadow, like France's Scalp cruise missile. We also know the UK is providing the Paveway 4 laser-guided bombs, but those bombs have a much shorter range, and so for those to be used, the F-16s will have to go much closer to Russia's air defences, into the range of Russia's air defences, and therefore in those scenarios you'd expect a series of steps to be taken first to disable, degrade those defences before the planes get close. Nonetheless, if not a war-winning shift, it will no doubt be a morale boost for Ukraine when those jets arrive. We'll keep an eye on that and keep you updated over the next few weeks. As ever, if you've got any questions, please, if you're watching on YouTube, do ask them in the comments below. We had an absolutely phenomenal response to last week's episode, thousands of comments. I've just picked out a few of the questions, one of which I've already addressed, and that was the question, why is Russia considering an escalation for Ukraine to use Western weapons against its territory, given that it is using other weapons from other countries, from North Korea, from China and from Iran against Ukraine. A sense of the sort of natural injustice, perhaps, of that Russian position. Russia is not necessarily logical in how it assesses its position versus the position of Ukraine or its allies, and doesn't necessarily see parity. I mean, ultimately, Vladimir Putin and his senior lieutenants have made it clear they don't believe Ukraine has a right to exist. They see it as an extension of Russia sort of de jure territory. They believe it should be Russian. The sentiment came through loud and clear in the comments that many of you believe Ukraine absolutely should have the right to use Western weapons to reply to Russia using both its weapons and weapons of its allies, Korea, China and Iran. One of the questions, quite interesting, looking at a different sphere of this conflict, is what happens when we face a full-scale cyber war. And what I'd say to that is actually that the head of Ukraine's cyber force has actually said that we are already witnessing the first cyber world war, and certainly cyber operatives in the UK have also paid tribute to Ukraine for the scale of the fight that they are already engaged in, and the fight which actually many allies are helping Ukraine perform. There are cyber attacks going on all the time. We see that. We saw that, potentially we saw that during the Victory Day parade, when a number of Russian television channels appeared to be hacked, and instead of broadcasting pictures of Russia's military might marching through Moscow, instead we saw footage suggesting that footage showing the devastation those Russian soldiers have caused in Ukraine, footage likening Vladimir Putin and his forces to Adolf Hitler's Nazis. So that most likely the result of a cyber attack. We've also seen other actors suggesting that China has been hacking Ukraine's government during the course of this conflict, stealing information that Beijing thinks will be useful possibly when it comes to getting reconstruction contracts in the aftermath of this war. Lots of players are involved. We've also seen, of course, just outside of Ukraine, but in the United Kingdom, the British Ministry of Defence revealing that one of its databases of its soldiers has been breached. Hackers gained access to personal information of basically the entire UK armed forces. Now, suggestion that may have been China, that China was involved, but others, cyber professionals, telling me that it's still far too early to say. All of that, just an example to say that a huge ongoing cyber conflict is happening. We don't always see it. It's not always clear what is state on state, what is criminal, but actually there is a huge cyber conflict happening, and it is particularly focused in Ukraine. We have seen at the very beginning of the war the banks attacked. We've seen the banks targeted. We've seen electricity networks targeted. Ukraine has managed, for the most part, to resist or rebuild pretty quickly. And the final question today is whether or not the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle has been more effective than the Abrams M1 tank. Now, both of these are American vehicles. Both of these have been donated to Ukraine, and both of them have been involved in frontline fighting. It's worth pointing out that we know we think the Abrams, I say we think, we can't be certain, we understand the Abrams tanks have been removed from the front line because so many of them have become vulnerable to Russian drones. And this is a problem that not just the Abrams have faced, but that all heavy armoured vehicles are facing in this conflict, is their vulnerability to relatively cheap, highly mobile and accurate one-way kamikaze attack drones, both the first-person view drones and larger kamikaze weapons, which can have, can, for a fraction of the cost of a tank or an armoured vehicle, can find it, hunt it, find it and destroy it. In terms of effectiveness, that's harder to gauge. We know that America donated at least 31 Abrams tanks, and we believe some 6 of them have been destroyed. On the other hand, with the Bradleys, more than 200 donated. According to the Oryx blog, some 78 of those have been destroyed. There's been pretty dramatic footage of both of them involved in firefights, both of them being effective. It would seem from those statistics that the Bradleys have perhaps been more engaged because of the level of destruction, the level of losses that they have suffered. It could also be a consequence. The Bradleys are lighter, less armoured and faster. They perform a slightly different role. They can carry infantry. They have a smaller 25mm gun, which is nonetheless hugely powerful. The Abrams, like other NATO tanks, primarily designed as a tank killer, but the nature of the battlefield, the nature of the terrain in Ukraine has not lent itself particularly to tank battles, to tank-on-tank confrontations, and that may be why the Abrams and indeed the British Challengers and the German-made Leopard 2 tanks have not been as involved as perhaps we would expect. That could also, however, be a consequence of the fact that apart from those few months at the end of last year, between late summer and winter last year, when Ukraine was launching its counter-offensive in south-central Zaporizhia, on the whole, Ukraine has been defending and trying to hold its front lines across the east and south of its country rather than attack. That's all we have time for this week. As ever, thank you very much for watching. And if you do have questions, please ask them in the comments below and we'll do our best to answer them next week.